All right, let's explore the nitrogen cycle. So, if you remember, 78% of our atmosphere contains nitrogen. But we can't use the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. The nitrogen in the atmosphere is in the form you see flashing, right? It's this two nitrogens joined together. Now, all living things need nitrogen in order to grow in terms of proteins and other bodily functions. But we as humans and other living organisms like sheep or cattle or most trees, birds, can't use this nitrogen. So how do we get nitrogen that we can use? Well, there's a couple of ways. This diagram is really, it's got a lot going on, and this cycle is one of the harder cycles to understand. So you really need to pay attention and think about the multiple ways nitrogen gets in our cycles. One of the ways that we actually lose nitrogen is over here on the side, and we're going to talk about that real fast. So, blue-green algae, right, gives us most of our oxygen. This algae actually will take up nitrogen, right? And then whatever eats that algae also gets the nitrogen that's taken up. And when things eat that nitrogen, they can produce proteins. Obviously, these living organisms die and they produce feces, and because they're in a marine system, those substances are lost to the marine sediment. So we don't really get back the nitrogen that blue-green algae take in. So, how do we get nitrogen? Well, one of the neat ways that nitrogen is transformed into a usable form is through lightning. So every time lightning strikes, electrons are moved and rearranged, and you get this form of nitrogen right here. So you have a nitrogen with 3 oxygens joined to it. This is a usable form. This is what we can use to help make proteins. Another way that this happens is through what we call nitrogen fixing bacteria, and this is really, really, really important. This is one of the more commonly missed questions on tests and misunderstood concepts. So what am I talking about? We're talking about bacteria that live in the soil, or they live in the roots of certain plants like legumes like peas or beans, or even clovers are really good plant for nitrogen fixing bacteria. And what they do is they are able, to take the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and transform it into this form you see here. And that's how we get soil nitrates. And these soil nitrates are this form right here, a nitrogen with 3 oxygens joined together. Now, how they do that isn't necessarily as important as just knowing, right, that we have microbes in the soil, and also on certain plants, like you can see here, and they live in these little nodules. And if you were to cut open these nodules, you can actually tell how healthy those nodules are based on the color on the inside. If they're nice and pink, then you know that the bacteria are thriving, and what they do is they supply nitrogen to the plant, and the plant supplies carbon to bacteria. All right, and so if the plant is supplying carbon to the bacteria, and if the nitrogen is supplying bacteria to the plant, then both individuals are benefiting. And if you remember, that's a particular type of relationship. Remember your relationships. You have parasitism and commensalism and mutualism, predator-prey relationships. So this would be an example of mutualism. The plant benefits and the bacteria benefit. All right. So, what do the bacteria do? Well, like I said, they add oxygens, then that gives us nitrates. So you need to remember nitrates equals a nitrogen with 3 oxygens. Something else that some bacteria can do is they can actually add hydrogens, and this is still important. So you have a nitrogen with 4 hydrogens, and that gives us ammonium, right? And ammonium is another important form of nitrogen that we use. All right, so let's get back to the cycle. So we've got all these soil nitrates. They're in the soil. Remember, everybody needs nitrates. So the plants need the nitrates. We need the nitrates. Other living organisms need the nitrates. And so what happens? Nitrates are taken up by plant roots, And then we eat those plants, other animals eat those plants, or the plants themselves form proteins using that nitrate. So ultimately, what is going on is you consume nitrates in some way, shape, or form, whether it be plant or animal, and then you use those nitrates to form proteins, right? And you are able to perform your normal functions. Eventually, what's going to happen, right? We're all going to die. So those dead organisms, and we also produce waste, and so that feces enters back into the system, and it forms what we call ammonium salts. So the rest of those nitrates, the N with the 3 oxygens, bacteria transforms those, decomposers transform those into ammonium. Nitrifying bacteria, right? Again, the bacteria in the soil will go back and convert this nitrogen again into soil nitrates. So you can see here that the cycle, right, continues round and around. Another important in terms of environmental science, another way that nitrates enter our system, enter the soil, enter the water, is through artificial inorganic fertilizers. So basically man-made products, man-made fertilizers. And we're going to talk about why that's important in just a second. As that cycle continues and you have this soil nitrate coming and the nitrates being taken up and then organisms dying and producing feces, right? What eventually happens is in boggy soils, so this is why wetlands are so important, marshes are so important, you have denitrifying bacteria. So they're cleaning, okay? They're cleaning up the feces, the waste, the nitrates, and transform that nitrogen back into atmospheric nitrogen. All right, so that's the cycle in a whole. We've talked about the nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is a key point. We've talked about where those bacteria live, why they're important. Now we need to talk about the human aspect. What is it that humans do that impact the nitrogen cycle? One other thing I wanted to mention real fast is another way that nitrogen enters our atmosphere is through volcanic action. And that's just natural. All right, so let's talk about what humans do. Eutrophication, right? That's a key term that you really need to set aside and get in your head. Eutrophication. So you have a body of water, all right, and it has fish and plants and other organisms, right? This can be fresh or it can be salt. Ultimately, what humans do, right, all those fertilizers that we use on farms and your yard and just anywhere in general, eventually, when we talk about watershed, right, they get washed into the oceans, into the watersheds, or into major rivers, or even into retention ponds in your neighborhood. If you've ever seen a little pond in a subdivision, that's a retention pond. If you pay attention, if we have a lot of rain, after all that rain has come through, and if the temperatures are right, that retention pond will turn green like you see here, right? This is eutrophication. Basically what's happening here is you have all that algae, okay? And that algae loves nitrogen. So when you have a massive dump of nitrogen into a body of water, if there's algae there, you can get what we call eutrophication. Now, why is this a bad thing? Why is this fish dead, right? Well, in order to function, algae takes in nitrogen, right? But it also takes up oxygen. And so ultimately, if you have too much algae in a body of water, you're going to end up with a lack of oxygen, and this can kill off lots and lots of living organisms. So what are some ways that we as human beings cause eutrophication? There's lots of different things. The biggest source of eutrophication, right, are these inorganic fertilizers. And it says nitrates and phosphates, but generally we're focusing on nitrates right now. So you have natural runoff, okay, that again, meaning natural, that's supposed to happen, whether it's from breakdown of rocks and dead things, right? There is a natural level of nitrates. That's just how it cycles through the system. But when you add inorganic fertilizers, manure runoff from feedlots, pollution runoff from streets and lawns, you have a runoff and erosion from mining, internal combustion, you have the dissolving of nitrogen oxides. Remember, one of our major primary pollutants. You have the discharge of treated municipal sewage, and then the discharge of untreated sewage, right? And discharge of detergents. All this discharge is all man-made. There's only one component here that's natural. There's only one arrow that's supposed to be a source of nitrogen. But then when you add up all the different ways that humans do this, you end up with common eutrophication events. And you've probably seen this in the news, especially around Florida. Recently, they had an overgrowth of algae, and it can be toxic. It irritates people's asthma and allergies, right? And then, of course, it can kill off living organisms in the water. So, key things to remember: 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but we can't use that nitrogen, right? We rely on nitrogen fixing bacteria that live in the soil or live in nodules on roots of certain plants to fix that nitrogen into what we call nitrates. We then take up those nitrates, we use them to perform bodily functions. Eventually, those nitrates are returned when we die or give off waste. And then bodies of water will help clean up some of that waste and return nitrogen in the N2 form back into the atmosphere. Last important point, right, is eutrophication, the overgrowth of algae due to human input. And that input can be fertilizers primarily, but manure runoff from feedlots, discharge of sewage, whether it's treated or untreated, and then the dissolving of nitrogen oxides, one of our primary pollutants.